Story 1. It's strange how the most innocent plans can lead you straight into something unimaginable. I was on a solo hiking trip through the national forest. It was early October, that sweet spot where the air feels crisp, but the forest is alive with fiery oranges and reds. My plan was simple: take a few days off from work, clear my head, and be alone. I didn't realize how alone I'd feel by the end of it. I left my truck at a gravel lot and started down a trail I'd marked on an old map. I wasn't exactly sure where it would lead, but that was part of the appeal. By mid-afternoon, the forest had swallowed me whole. The trees stretched high and dense, muffling the sounds of the outside world until even my footsteps felt intrusive. It was peaceful at first, but after hours of walking, the isolation began to feel heavier. Around 3 p.m., I stumbled upon what I can only describe as remnants of an old mining claim. The forest seemed to part just slightly, revealing the decaying skeleton of a structure, rotted wood beams barely standing, and a rusted metal sign leaning against a fallen tree. There was no trail leading to it, no indication it was anything significant. It was like the forest had been trying to hide it. I stood there for a moment, debating whether I should explore or stick to my route. Curiosity won out. As I walked closer, the air seemed colder, even though the sun was still high. My boots crunched over broken glass and scattered metal. There wasn't much left of the structure, just enough to imagine what it might have been. A small cabin or maybe a shed. But what really caught my attention was the plot of land next to it. A family plot. There were 5 graves, outlined with crude stones. The headstones themselves were simple and weathered, most of the inscriptions completely illegible. I crouched down to inspect one, running my fingers over the faint carvings. A name and date had been etched deep enough to withstand time, but they were still hard to read. The year was 1897. Then I saw it. The last grave in the row had a headstone that was almost pristine compared to the others, as if someone had carved it decades later. I wiped the dirt off with my sleeve, revealing the name. My heart stopped cold. It was my name. I don't mean just a coincidence, like a John Smith kind of thing. I mean my first name and last name, spelled almost exactly as mine was, save for a single letter in the surname. It was off by 1. My mouth went dry. I stared at the stone as if blinking would make it disappear. The dates beneath the name made it worse. Born October 14th, 1873. Died October 14th, 1897. My birthday. My exact birthday, though I was 28, not 24. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was just a wild coincidence, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I hadn't seen a soul all day. I stepped back from the grave, trying to steady my breathing, when I noticed something else. Faded silk flowers had been placed at the base of the tombstone. They were brittle, almost disintegrating, but unmistakable. Someone had been here, and not all that long ago. The flowers wouldn't have lasted more than a year or 2. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my body refused to move. Instead, I did the dumbest thing I've ever done. I reached down, picked up the flowers, and stuffed them into my backpack. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the overwhelming strangeness of the moment, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself it was all real. Either way, as soon as the flowers were in my pack, the forest changed. The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees like a warning. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. Every instinct I had screamed run, but the woods felt alive, watching, listening. When I finally turned to leave, I swear I heard something behind me. It wasn't footsteps. It was heavier, like someone, or something, dragging itself through the underbrush. I spun around, my heart in my throat. But there was nothing there. Just the trees. My pulse pounded in my ears as I backed away slowly, clutching the straps of my pack. I don't remember much about the hike back to camp, only that it felt like the forest didn't want me there anymore. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every snap of a twig made me flinch. By the time I reached my tent, it was nearly dark. I zipped myself inside and sat there in silence, clutching the flowers like some kind of talisman. That night I didn't sleep. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd taken something I wasn't supposed to, that the grave I'd found wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like I'd been marked, chosen somehow. At one point, I thought I heard whispering outside my tent, but when I unzipped it and looked, there was nothing there. The next morning, I packed up and left the forest as fast as I could. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not the grave, not the flowers, nothing. They wouldn't believe me anyway. For years, I kept those silk flowers in a drawer, though I never looked at them. I just couldn't bring myself to throw them away. Then a few months ago, I lost them. I have no idea where they went. Maybe I threw them out without thinking, or maybe they just disappeared. Story 2. Here's a suspense-filled story based on your guidelines. We live in a quiet little town, tucked away at the base of a mountain range. Hiking trails are everywhere, and my husband and I often take advantage of them. It's peaceful, serene, an escape from the monotony of life, or at least it used to be. It was a cool autumn morning, the kind where the air is crisp and the trees are blazing in shades of orange and red. My husband Chris had the day off, so we decided to hike up Hollow Creek Trail. It wasn't a tough trail, but it was secluded, which we liked. Fewer people meant fewer distractions. We started just after sunrise. The woods were alive with the hum of nature, birds chirping, leaves rustling, the occasional distant sound of running water. I felt good, energized even, as we climbed higher along the winding path. Chris was ahead of me, his head down, focused on the trail. About half an hour in, I noticed him. A man in a red shirt coming down the trail toward us. He wasn't particularly remarkable, maybe in his mid-40s, average build, unkempt hair, but there was something about the way he walked that gave me pause. His gait was odd, almost mechanical, and his eyes, they didn't look at us. Not at first, anyway. As he passed, he gave me this quick glance, just a flick of his eyes like he didn't want to be seen looking. I nodded out of courtesy, but he didn't acknowledge me, just kept walking. Something about him made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. It was probably nothing. We kept climbing. The trail got steeper, and the trees grew denser, blocking out more and more of the morning light. That's when I saw him again. He was coming down the trail, same as before. Same red shirt, same mechanical stride, same fleeting glance. I froze mid-step. "Chris," I said, grabbing his arm. "That guy, wasn't he just here?" Chris turned, looking back at the man, who was now a few yards away and heading in the opposite direction. "What guy?" "The one in the red shirt," I hissed. "We just passed him 10 minutes ago." Chris shrugged. "I don't know, babe. Maybe he looped around on a different trail?" "There's no other trail," I snapped. "Hollow Creek is one way up, one way down. You know that." Chris rolled his eyes. "You're overthinking it. Let's keep moving." But I couldn't shake the feeling. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him again. My heart was racing, my stomach in knots. Something was wrong. We pressed on for another 20 minutes. The trail grew eerily quiet. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. Then there he was. He was farther down the trail this time, just standing there, waiting. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed Chris again, harder this time. "Do you see him now?" I whispered, my voice trembling. Chris squinted, his brow furrowing. "What are you talking about?" "Right there," I pointed, but the man was gone. I swear to God, he was there 1 second and gone the next, like he'd been swallowed by the forest. "Okay," Chris said, his tone shifting to something softer, more concerned. "Maybe we should head back." But I didn't want to go back. I couldn't. The thought of turning around and walking past where I'd just seen him sent a cold wave of terror through me. "No," I said firmly. "Let's keep going. We'll take the ridge trail back down." Chris hesitated but eventually nodded. We started moving again, faster this time. My eyes darted around the woods, scanning every shadow, every flicker of movement. The trail began to level out, and I let myself hope we'd outrun him, whatever he was. But then I heard it. Footsteps. Not ours. They were heavy, deliberate, coming from somewhere behind us. I didn't dare look back. "Chris," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Do you hear that?" He stopped and listened, his expression darkening. "Yeah." We turned around together, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped too. I wanted to run, but the trail was narrow, bordered by steep drop-offs. Running wasn't an option. We started walking again, our pace quick and jerky. The footsteps resumed, always just behind us. Chris grabbed my hand, his grip tight. "Don't stop," he said. "Just keep moving." We didn't speak after that. Every step felt like a lifetime. The air around us grew colder, heavier, like it was pressing down on my chest. Finally, we reached the ridge trail, the path opening up to a clearing. I let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through me. But then Chris froze. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer. I followed his gaze, and my stomach dropped. There, at the edge of the clearing, was the man in the red shirt. He wasn't walking this time. He was just standing there, staring at us. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes, they weren't human. They were black, empty voids that seemed to swallow the light around them. "Run," Chris said, his voice low and urgent. We took off, sprinting down the ridge trail as fast as we could. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. When we finally reached the trailhead, the parking lot was empty. The sun was high in the sky now, the forest bright and alive again, as if nothing had happened. But I know what I saw. I haven't been back to Hollow Creek since, and I don't plan to. Chris doesn't talk about it. He pretends it never happened. He's scared, just like me. Story 3. The Hike. I live in a quiet town on the edge of the Rockies, not far from Paradise Valley, Montana. It's a place where solitude is easy to find and silence feels alive. It was early spring, and the morning had been clear and bitterly cold, the kind of cold that burns your lungs and makes your breath hang in the air like ghostly wisps. I wanted to shake off the winter blues, so I decided to hike a 6-mile out-and-back trail up a canyon I'd heard about, one that ended at a waterfall. It was supposed to be beautiful, and I figured my dog, Molly, could use the exercise. We set off early, just as the sun was cresting the peaks. Molly, a sleek black lab mix, bounded ahead, her breath puffing like steam in the crisp air. The trail wove through towering pines, and the sound of the creek running alongside us was the only noise, apart from the occasional call of a jay. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I ignored the nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. At about 2 miles in, things changed. Molly froze mid-step, her nose in the air, ears pinned back. She let out a low, throaty growl, something she almost never did. "What is it, girl?" I asked, crouching down to scratch her head. Her eyes darted toward the trees on our right, and her body trembled like she was barely holding herself together. I looked where she was staring, but saw nothing, just endless trees and shadows. "Come on," I coaxed, tugging gently at her leash. She hesitated, then followed, though her steps were reluctant, her tail tucked so tightly between her legs it nearly disappeared. As we walked, her behavior grew stranger. Molly, normally bold and curious, began ducking into bushes or scrambling behind rocks, as if she were trying to hide from something. Her head constantly turned, her eyes scanning the trees. Every so often, she'd sniff the air and whimper, a sound that sent chills rippling down my spine. The forest around us had gone quiet, too quiet. The usual background noise, chirping birds, the rustling of branches in the wind, had vanished. The only sounds were our footsteps crunching on the icy trail and Molly's increasingly frantic breathing. By then, the clouds had started to roll in, heavy and gray, and the temperature felt like it had dropped even lower. My unease grew with every step. I knelt down to check on Molly, who was trembling so violently her leash quivered in my hands. Her wide, frightened eyes locked onto mine, and it felt like she was begging me to leave. "All right, girl," I muttered, my voice shaking. "We're turning back." We hurried down the trail, Molly still skittish, her head whipping side to side as if she expected something to leap out at us. I kept glancing over my shoulder, too, though I wasn't sure why. There was nothing there. Nothing I could see anyway. About a mile from the trailhead, it hit me, a smell. Faint at first, but unmistakable. Coppery, metallic, like blood. My stomach turned, and Molly's pace quickened. I didn't say a word, just tightened my grip on her leash and walked faster. The smell grew stronger the closer we got to the parking lot. My mind raced, trying to rationalize it. An injured deer, maybe, or a predator's kill. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Finally, the parking lot came into view, and relief washed over me. Molly seemed to sense it too. She picked up her pace, practically dragging me the last few yards. That's when I noticed them. Two men near an SUV, unpacking camera gear. Big lenses, tripods, the whole setup. One of them, a tall guy in a thick down jacket, glanced up as we approached. "Hey there," he called, his voice cheerful. "You out on the trail?" "Yeah," I said, my breath visible in the freezing air. "Not for long, though. My dog was acting strange." The man chuckled, nodding toward Molly, who was now cowering behind my legs. "That's not surprising. We heard one of the wolf packs moved into this canyon last night. Figured we'd try to catch a glimpse." "Wolves?" My voice came out sharper than I intended. "Yeah," he said casually, adjusting his camera strap. "Tracks all over near the trailhead this morning. Big ones. You see anything?" I shook my head, my mouth suddenly dry. "No, just, my dog acting weird. Guess she must have smelled them." The man smiled. "They'll do that. Wolves are no joke. Be glad you got out when you did." I nodded, muttered a quick goodbye, and hurried to my car. Molly jumped into the back seat without hesitation, curling into a tight ball as if trying to make herself disappear. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been out there, something more than wolves. Molly didn't settle the entire ride home, her eyes fixed on the rear window, as if she expected whatever it was to follow us. I never went back to that trail, and I've never been able to explain the metallic smell, the silence, or the way Molly, my fearless, loyal companion, had been so utterly terrified. Sometimes late at night, I think about those men, standing there with their cameras, and I wonder if they ever saw what they were looking for, or if it saw them first. Story 4. It was the summer after college graduation, and my friends and I decided to do something big to celebrate. A backpacking trip through Point Reyes National Seashore. The plan was simple: hike to a beach campsite, spend the day swimming and relaxing, then trek back the next morning. None of us were new to the outdoors, but there was a certain electricity in the air that trip. Maybe it was the thrill of being somewhere wild, or maybe it was just the moonlight dancing on the coastal cliffs. I don't know, but I'll never forget that night. We set out at 3 in the morning, the moon bright enough to keep our headlamps off. The trail was narrow, surrounded by tall grass, and every sound carried in the stillness. The crunch of boots on dirt, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant crash of waves. It was peaceful. Perfect even. At least that's how it felt until we reached the bluff. The path curved sharply ahead, a blind corner where the grass was taller than my waist. We were joking about who could claim the first cold beer when we got to the beach when Steve, the guy in front of me, cursed under his breath. "Crap, drop my knife," he muttered, already crouching to search the ground. I sighed and flicked on my headlamp to help him look. That's when I saw it. Two glowing green orbs, low in the grass, right at the bend in the trail. At first, my brain didn't process what I was looking at. "Hey, Steve, do you see that?" I whispered, my voice already tight. "See what?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The light caught those eyes again. Green, unblinking, and too far apart to belong to anything harmless. My stomach dropped. I've heard people talk about fight or flight, but in that moment, I just froze. I felt like prey. Steve followed my gaze and went rigid. "Oh, shit!" His voice was barely audible. "What? What is it?" Ellie, one of our friends, whispered from behind me. "Mountain lion." I managed to get out, my voice shaking. That's when the others saw it too. The realization passed through the group like an electric current. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. I don't think any of us even blinked. The thing about mountain lions is, they don't want you to see them. If you do, it usually means one of two things. Either it's curious, or it's deciding whether you're worth the effort. And when you're on foot, 5 feet from a predator like that, you're at its mercy. "We have to keep moving," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Slow. No sudden movements. Stay together." Steve nodded and we started walking, inching forward like we were stepping through a minefield. I kept my headlamp locked on those glowing eyes. They didn't move. Not an inch. The rest of its body was hidden in the grass. but I could feel its presence, big, heavy, and terrifyingly still. As we approached the bend, my heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. The trail narrowed, forcing us closer to the lion. 5 feet. That's all that separated us from those eyes. "Don't run," I muttered under my breath, mostly to myself. Running would trigger its instincts. We all knew that. The air felt thick, like something primal and ancient was pressing down on us. Every step felt wrong, like we were trespassing in a place we didn't belong. And then we were past it, just like that. 10 feet, then 20. Still, those eyes didn't move. I kept my light on them until the trail curved again, putting the grass and the lion out of sight. "That was too close," Ellie whispered once we were a safe distance away. Nobody said anything for a while after that. I think we were all trying to process what just happened. The rest of the hike was silent, the earlier excitement completely drained. Every shadow, every rustle in the grass set my nerves on edge. We made it to the beach as the sun started to rise, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd left something behind. Or maybe it followed us. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I kept imagining those green eyes watching from the dunes, waiting for us to let our guard down. Story 5. It was early fall when I went up to Rocky Mountain National Park. I'd been hiking solo for a few days, just wanting to get away from the noise, to be in the quiet. I had a tent, a sleeping bag, and the kind of solitude that's hard to come by in the modern world. The kind that almost feels sacred. The weather had been beautiful, clear skies, crisp air. But as the sun dipped below the mountains that night, something shifted. I was camped off one of the less traveled trails, a few miles from the main path. The trees were thick, and the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves. My fire had just died down, and the world around me felt unnervingly still. It's the kind of stillness that presses against you, like the land itself is holding its breath. I just zipped up my tent when the first sound hit me. At first it was barely audible, a faint rustle, then a whimper. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just some creature, but my gut told me otherwise. There was something off about it. The cry sounded too human, too desperate. It was high-pitched, but not like a child's laughter, more like a scream. The kind of scream you'd hear if someone was in mortal danger. I froze. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, but underneath it, I could still hear it. The sound of a child screaming in agony. It wasn't just one cry, either. It was like a stuttering, interrupted scream, as if someone, something, was trying to scream but couldn't quite finish it. The noises were coming from the woods just beyond the edge of my camp. I'm not ashamed to admit that a chill ran through me. The kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes your stomach turn. I wasn't a stranger to the woods, but there was something wrong here. Something I couldn't explain. I grabbed my flashlight, heart pounding. I told myself it was nothing, just an animal in distress. Maybe a baby bird or something caught in a trap. I convinced myself it wasn't what I thought it might be. But deep down, I knew. Whatever was making that sound wasn't natural. I stepped out of the tent, shining the light toward the edge of the trees. The beam flickered, as though the darkness itself was pushing back against me. The scream came again, closer this time. My throat went dry. The sound was unmistakable. A child, begging, pleading. But then the sound twisted, turning into something unrecognizable. It was as if whatever was making the noise was choking, trying to scream but failing. The kind of strangled noise that gets stuck in your throat, suffocating from the inside. I should have stayed in the tent. I should have packed up and left. But instead I stood there, transfixed like an idiot, listening. My flashlight darted around the clearing, but the trees just seemed to close in, shifting with the shadows. The scream cut through the silence again, but this time it was longer, more drawn out, like something was dying or worse, being tortured. I stumbled backward. My body was telling me to run, to get as far away as possible, but I couldn't move. The sound, it had an effect on me. It was like it was pulling me in, reaching for me. I forced myself to turn, to go back to the tent. I had to get away from that noise, away from whatever was causing it. But as I spun around, I heard something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone or something was walking toward me. I'm telling you, I was paralyzed with fear. My breath caught in my chest, my hands shaking. The footsteps came closer, each one heavy, like the weight of them was pressing down on me. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt them. It was like they were right there, just behind me, just outside of the circle of my flashlight's glow. I didn't dare turn around. I couldn't. The screaming was louder now, almost deafening. It echoed through the trees, vibrating in my bones. It was so real, so raw. I could hear the ragged breaths in between the screams, the frantic, desperate gasps as though the thing was fighting for its life. Then there was a sharp, sickening silence. It felt like the world itself had gone still. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Just complete, terrifying silence. I dared to look over my shoulder. The woods were dark. The trees were as still as statues. But the air, it felt wrong. There was something in the air, something heavy. I didn't know what was happening, but I had a feeling I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned back to the tent and almost ran into it. The next thing I knew, I was inside. The zipper pulled shut behind me. My heart was racing, my palms slick with sweat. I lay there staring at the ceiling of the tent, listening. The wind howled again, but the screaming had stopped. In its place, I heard something else. A dragging sound, slow and deliberate. Like something heavy, something large was being pulled through the forest. My breath hitched. I told myself it was just an animal, but I knew. Whatever it wasn't an animal. That dragging sound went on for what felt like forever. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, it stopped. The silence returned, thicker this time, heavier. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening to every sound, waiting for that scream to come back. But it never did. The morning came, and the world was calm again. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the sky a soft pink. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there with me, something that wasn't supposed to be, something that had made that sound. I packed up my things and left the park that day, faster than I had planned. I never went back. And I'll never forget that scream. Story 6, I live in a small, quiet town tucked away in the forested hills. It's the kind of place where the days stretch long and silent, the kind where the trees seem to whisper secrets on the wind. I'm not the type of person to get spooked easily. Spent enough years as a corrections officer to know how to handle my nerves. But what happened that day? I still can't shake it. It was an ordinary Saturday morning when I decided to go on a hike. I'd been cooped up all week dealing with the usual, and I needed to clear my head. The trail I was taking is one I know well. It's a quiet path, off the beaten track, winding through dense woods and steep slopes. I've hiked it more times than I can count, but that day was different. I didn't know it then, but something about the air felt off. I parked my truck at the trailhead, threw on my pack, and started off. The morning was cool, the kind of crisp air that feels good against your skin. The ground was damp from an early mist that hadn't quite burned off, but that's nothing unusual. The trail was familiar, the kind of place where your feet find the path almost without thinking. I didn't rush, just walked at a steady pace, letting my mind wander. By the time I'd gone 4 miles in, I hadn't seen another soul. Just the forest, the trees, the sound of my own breathing, and the occasional rustle of a bird or squirrel in the underbrush. That's when I saw him. At first it didn't register. I turned a corner in the trail and caught sight of a man, maybe 100 feet away. He was bent over, digging in the earth with a shovel. He wasn't far off the path, but he was out of the way enough that I wouldn't have expected anyone to be there. I froze, my foot still lifted mid-step, and I stared at him. He was tall, but the way he stood, bent over like that, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, I couldn't make out any details. He looked strange somehow, out of place. I don't know why I waved. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe I was trying to tell myself I wasn't afraid. I smiled, half a wave, trying to act like everything was normal. But the second my hand went up, I saw his head snap toward me. His eyes, dark, almost hollow, locked onto mine, and my heart slammed into my ribs. I shouldn't have smiled. I shouldn't have waved. There was something wrong about the way he looked at me. It wasn't curiosity. It wasn't friendliness. It was something colder, something unsettling. His gaze didn't waver, and he didn't say a word. He just stood there, holding that shovel, as if he was waiting for me to do something. I felt a surge of fear crawl up my spine, but I forced myself to turn away. My feet kept moving, but my mind was spinning. I kept walking, trying to keep my pace steady, but I couldn't stop thinking about him. I kept looking back over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the trees. I don't know why I felt the need to look back. There was no reason. I should have kept going. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The trail was silent around me. No wind, no birds, not even the usual distant sound of traffic from the nearby road. Just the crunch of my boots on the soft earth. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled with every step. I couldn't get his eyes out of my head. I kept imagining them, those dark, hollow eyes, watching me, waiting. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just another hiker, maybe just someone working in the woods. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I didn't know who he was, but I had this sickening feeling that I shouldn't have waved. I shouldn't have made myself known. I pushed forward, forcing myself to keep going. But the further I went, the worse it felt. The silence around me grew oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I should have turned back. I knew that now, but it was too late. The path stretched ahead, twisting through trees and shadows. Then there it was, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, everything was still again, and I thought maybe I was imagining things. But no, there it was again, just behind me, the soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. I didn't dare look back at first. My mind was screaming, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to know what was behind me. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe someone else was hiking the trail. But then I heard it again, a sound just a little too close, a little too deliberate. I took off running. My breath came in ragged gasps as my feet pounded the trail, heart hammering in my chest. The forest whipped past in a blur. I couldn't look back. I didn't dare. Every footstep behind me felt like a weight, pressing down on me, getting closer, faster. I ran until my legs burned, until my lungs screamed for air. But the footsteps kept pace, always just a little too close. Then in one moment of terrible clarity, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The footsteps weren't fading. They were coming closer. I burst through the trees and back into the clearing where I had parked my truck, but I didn't stop running. I didn't even look back. I threw open the door, jumped in, and slammed it shut behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them. I started the engine, and with a screech of tires I drove off, not stopping until I reached the safety of the main road. I never saw that man again. Never heard of any missing hikers, no news, nothing. Story 7. We lived in a quiet suburban area, a few miles outside the city. Our house was nestled at the edge of a thick forest, and the wooded park was just a short walk away, perfect for an evening hike to unwind after dinner. My husband and I made it a habit to walk the trails every evening. The park was peaceful, surrounded by tall trees, thick underbrush, and winding creeks. We had come to know the park's wildlife well. The raccoon that would sometimes swim up the creek, the deer that grazed near the misty bogs, and even the skittish feral hogs that darted through the marsh grass. We were always on the lookout for something new, but we never felt anything but safe there. It was our place to relax. One evening, we were nearing the end of our usual loop, the last stretch before the trail would lead us back to the road. The sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow through the trees, and the air felt cooler as the light began to fade. We were walking along a relatively wide path when we heard voices. Two men talking. We hadn't seen them at first, but the voices grew louder as we approached. They didn't sound like they belonged to anyone we knew, and they sounded a little off. There was an edge to them, but it wasn't clear what it was. At first, we kept walking, thinking nothing of it. We had seen other people out in the park before, joggers, other hikers, the occasional family out for a stroll, but something about these voices felt different. My husband subtly nudged me, and we both slowed down, careful not to alert them that we had heard them. Then we saw them. They were standing off to the side of the trail, partially hidden by the thick undergrowth, but we could clearly see them now. One man stood with his back turned, facing the woods, and the other was crouched low, seemingly digging at the ground with a shovel. We were too far away to hear any specific words, but their voices were tense, like they were having an argument, or perhaps just speaking too sharply to one another. As we drew closer, I wasn't sure if we should acknowledge them or pretend we hadn't noticed. My heart began to race. They didn't look like any park goers we'd seen before, scruffy, unkempt, their clothes mismatched and worn. The man with his back to us never turned around, but the other, his face twisted with a strange, uneasy grin, suddenly turned and looked right at us. His eyes were wide and darting around, as though he was trying to calculate something. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was an intensity there that made my skin crawl. "Hey there," he called, his voice a little too loud, a little too cheerful. I forced a smile, my stomach tightening. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I didn't want to show fear, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The other man didn't move, didn't acknowledge us. He just kept digging, his movements quick and purposeful. I glanced over at my husband, and I could see that he was equally unnerved. Without saying a word, we both picked up our pace, pretending like we hadn't noticed anything unusual, though we could both feel the tension between us. We kept walking, the sound of their voices fading behind us, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. My husband kept glancing back, and I could see that his face had gone pale. We reached the intersection of the trail that led back to the parking lot. I took a deep breath, but my pulse was still racing. We turned onto the new trail, and as soon as we were out of sight, we picked up the pace, practically running toward the car. The whole drive home, neither of us said much. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. Why were those men out there, in the middle of nowhere, acting so strange? And why had one of them been digging? It wasn't until we got back to the house that we finally spoke. My husband was the first to break the silence. "We need to call the cops," he said. His voice was tight but determined. I nodded. I knew we couldn't ignore it. There was something deeply wrong about what we had seen. I made the call. The officer who came out to take the report didn't seem too concerned. He listened to our story, his face neutral, and then told us that the men were probably just dumping trash or doing some kind of maintenance work. He didn't ask for much detail, and he didn't seem interested in investigating further. "People do strange things in the wood," he said, shrugging. "No harm done. Just stay aware, and don't be afraid to call again if you see anything suspicious." We never heard back from the police after that, and as time passed, the whole encounter began to feel like a distant memory, but something about it never sat right with me. I kept thinking back to the way that man had looked at me, his darting eyes, his strange, forced smile, the way he'd been so quick to speak to us, almost like he was trying to assess whether we had seen something we shouldn't have. And I couldn't stop thinking about the other man who had just stood there, still, as though waiting for something. We never went back to the park. Even now, I can't bring myself to drive past it. It's not just that it was unsettling. It was the way it felt like we had stumbled upon something we weren't meant to see, a secret, a warning. And even now, I'm not so sure that the police believed us. I don't know what those men were doing, but the unease I felt that day has never really gone away. Story 8. I'm not the type of person who scares easily. I've been through some pretty unsettling things in my life. Working in a jail, seeing things I can't explain. But this was different. It was a Saturday, and my girlfriend and I decided to hike to Black Star Canyon Falls. We'd heard about the place from some friends and figured it'd be a good day trip. The hike itself wasn't too bad, about 8 miles round trip, but it was rougher than we expected. The terrain was uneven, and the further we went, the quieter it got. That's when I started to feel something strange in the air. It wasn't just the stillness or the remote location. It felt almost oppressive, like the land itself was holding its breath. My girlfriend noticed it too. "You feel that?" she asked, glancing over at me. Yeah, I said. It's weird. We kept walking, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. I figured it was just the isolation. After all, it was a remote area with nothing but dirt trails and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But as we descended further into the canyon, it became harder to ignore. My heart rate quickened for no reason, and I started looking over my shoulder more often, sensing something, watching. The falls were incredible when we finally reached them. The water cascading down into the pool below was mesmerizing, but I couldn't enjoy it. The whole time, a nagging sense of dread clawed at me, like something was wrong. My skin crawled. I think we should start heading back, I told my girlfriend. We're losing daylight. She agreed without hesitation, which was strange because normally she's the one who likes to take her time at places like this. But today she seemed just as anxious as I was. We started to climb back up the trail, but the further we went, the worse it got. The trees around us seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer and longer. The sun was setting, and it felt like we were racing against it. I could feel the air turning colder, heavier. My thoughts started to spiral. What if we got stuck out here? What if something happened? My eyes darted around, half expecting something to emerge from the trees. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like whispering. I froze, straining to hear. At first I thought it was just the wind, but it wasn't. It was voices, low and urgent, like something, was trying to say something to me. My blood ran cold. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. My girlfriend's face went pale. I thought I heard something too. We both stopped, listening. The whispering stopped as soon as we did, replaced by a dead silence. It felt suffocating. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I didn't want to show it. We're fine, I said, trying to reassure both of us. It's probably just animals. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The hairs on my neck were standing up, and the back of my mind was screaming that something was wrong. We kept walking, but it felt like the world had shifted. The trees seemed to grow taller, the shadows darker. It wasn't just the lack of light. It was like the very landscape was wrong. The path ahead seemed unfamiliar, and I had this overwhelming feeling of being lost. But I knew we were on the right trail. We hadn't taken any wrong turns. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But as I squinted into the growing darkness, I saw it clearly. A figure, a tall, dark shape standing off the trail, barely visible between the trees. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move. I grabbed my girlfriend's arm. "Do you see that?" I hissed. She looked, her face going white. "Oh my God, what is that?" I don't know why I didn't run. Maybe I thought it was some other hiker who had gotten lost, but something deep inside told me it wasn't. The figure just stood there, staring at us. Or so it felt. It didn't make a sound. It didn't move. We started walking faster, my steps quickening until I was nearly jogging. My girlfriend was right behind me, but I could hear the panic in her breath. "What the hell was that?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, my throat dry. "But we need to get out of here." We kept moving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was like the world around us was starting to bend, like we were no longer in control. The trees, the rocks, even the air itself felt alive. I could feel it watching me, pressing down on me from every direction. Every step felt heavier. I checked my phone. The time was moving too fast. We'd been walking for what felt like hours, but it had only been minutes. The sun had almost completely set, and the canyon was swallowed in darkness. And then the voices came again. This time, they weren't whispers. They were full sentences, urgent, pleading, angry. It felt like they were coming from all around us, but there was no one there. The sound was deafening, echoing in my skull. I grabbed my girlfriend's hand. "Run! Now!" We ran. I don't even know how far we went. My legs were burning, my breath ragged, but I couldn't stop. The voices followed, louder and clearer, until they were right behind us. I could feel them closing in. I could feel the darkness chasing us, consuming us. I don't know how, but we made it to the car, breathless and shaken. When we got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I Googled the area, hoping to make sense of what happened. That's when I learned about the Manson cult, about the Shoshone massacre. I felt sick. It wasn't just a hike, it was a place haunted by blood and violence. The air there, it felt like it carried the weight of everything that had happened. I don't know if it was the history of the land or something else, but whatever it was, it got to me. Next time I go, I'll make sure to be there early, before the sun sets, and pray I never have to feel that again. Story 9. I live in a small town in southern Utah, a place where the red rock landscape stretches as far as the eye can see. The air is thin and crisp, and the silence of the desert is suffocating. The kind of silence where your thoughts are the loudest thing around. I had always found peace in the wilderness, an escape from the noise of the world. So when I set out on my solo hike into North Pariah Canyon, I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. I thought it would be just another trip, just me, the canyon, and the endless sky. I'd hiked for about 9 miles when I finally found my spot, a narrow ledge about 600 feet up the side of a cliff. The view was incredible. The Pariah River wound its way through the canyon below, barely visible from where I stood. Behind me, another towering cliff rose up, almost 800 feet high, and beyond that, the stark, rugged mesa. I was deep into the wilderness, far from any other human, just the canyon and me. There wasn't a single soul in sight for miles. I set up camp quickly, eager to settle in for the night. It was winter, so the days were short, and by 8 or 8:30, the sun had long since disappeared behind the horizon. The air was cold, but I was tucked into my sleeping bag, warm and content. The only sound was the occasional rustle of the wind moving through the canyon. I must have drifted off to sleep quickly, lulled by the stillness around me. I woke up in the middle of the night, disoriented, unsure of where I was. The darkness of my tent felt thicker than usual. It was quiet at first, too quiet. But then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Thump, thump, thump. Heavy, slow, but deliberate. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. At first I thought it was just a deer, or maybe a ram, something common in the area. They usually shuffle when they walk, light and quick. But this was different. The steps were too heavy, too repetitive, and they were coming closer. Thump, thump, thump. My body tensed, every muscle ready to spring into action, but I couldn't move. My breath caught in my throat. I was no longer sure if I was dreaming or awake. Then it happened. A scream. It shattered the silence of the night, like the scream of something not human. The sound was raw, inhuman, high-pitched and shrill, like it was coming straight from the bowels of hell. It was directed at me. I could feel it, deep in my bones. It wasn't a random scream. It wasn't some animal call. It was like someone, or something, was screaming directly at me, as if it knew I was there. I grabbed my knife, instinct taking over. My mind was racing, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. My hands were shaking as I gripped the handle, the cold steel against my palm feeling strangely comforting. I was ready for whatever was coming. The scream echoed in my ears, relentless. And then, silence. The kind of silence that presses in on you. The kind where your own heartbeat feels like it's the only thing left alive. The footsteps stopped. The scream stopped. All that remained was the pounding of my own pulse in my ears. I held my breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Nothing. I lay there in the dark, paralyzed. My mind was a mess of questions, of fear. What the hell had just happened? I hadn't heard another person in days. There was no way anyone else was up here. Not this far in the canyon, not this high on the cliff. And yet, I'd heard those footsteps. I'd heard that scream. I glanced toward the entrance of my tent, where the zipper barely glowed in the moonlight. For a split second, I considered looking out. But then the thought of what might be waiting for me on the other side stopped me cold. What if it was still out there? What if whatever it was had been watching me the whole time? I lay back down, gripping my knife so tightly my knuckles ached. I tried to breathe, tried to calm my racing heart, but it wasn't working. The cold air around me felt heavier now, like it had shifted somehow. It didn't feel like the same peaceful wilderness I'd come to know. It felt wrong. I couldn't sleep. I don't know how much time passed, but the fear didn't let up. It was a tangible thing, like it had taken root inside me and refused to leave. I kept hearing things, small sounds, footsteps, the rustle of something moving just out of sight. Every time I thought I heard something, I would freeze, holding my breath, waiting for it to come closer. But nothing came. The whole night felt like an eternity, but eventually the sky started to lighten, the first hint of dawn creeping over the horizon. The terror that had gripped me the night before slowly faded, though it left a lingering sense of dread, a gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. I didn't stay long after that. I packed up my camp as quickly as I could, every movement frantic, my eyes darting to the edges of the cliff, scanning for any sign of what had happened the night before. I didn't want to stay another minute. The hike back down to the river felt endless. My thoughts kept returning to that scream, to those footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that canyon, that whatever I'd heard was still out there, waiting for me. I've never told anyone about that night. Who would believe me? It sounds crazy even to me, but the terror I felt, the way that scream rattled me to my core, I can't explain it, and I don't want to. There are some things better left unsaid, better left forgotten. Story 10. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake what happened that summer. I've always loved camping, especially during the summer, and bouldering with my friends in that forest was our thing. It was an hour-and-a-half drive from where I lived, so it was a bit of a trek, but we didn't care. We'd spend the whole weekend out there, camping by the rocks, climbing all day, then crashing under the stars at night. That one summer, though, that summer, it all changed. It was one of those trips where we'd been out there a few times before, so we knew the area pretty well. We had a routine: climb, set up camp, eat, hang out by the fire, go to sleep. On the third or fourth time, something strange happened. My friend Anna had left her climbing gear and rucksack just outside her tent the night before. Or at least, we thought she did. None of us thought much of it. The gear was heavy and she was tired, so it made sense for her to leave it by her tent for the night. But the next morning when we woke up, things were off. Anna's boots were gone. Not just the boots, but her chalk bag, a few of her clothes, and her climbing gear. Her rucksack was nowhere to be found either. We figured she had misplaced them somehow, maybe moved them while sleepwalking, or just didn't remember where she'd left them. But there was something unsettling about it. We all knew we'd seen them right next to her tent the night before. Still, we didn't want to jump to conclusions. We told ourselves maybe an animal dragged them off. After all, it wasn't unheard of for a curious bear or raccoon to snatch things if they smelled food. We all laughed it off, even though none of us really felt like laughing. A year later, we were back out there. We set up camp, joked around, had a few drinks, and settled by the fire after dinner. The forest at night was always a little eerie, but there was something familiar about it too. The crackling of the fire, the rustle of leaves in the wind. It all felt safe, like it always did. It wasn't until much later that night, after everyone had settled into their tents, that things took a turn. I'd gotten up to take a leak. It was pitch black, except for the glow from the campfire that barely reached past our campsite. The trees around us seemed to swallow the light, making everything feel more isolated than usual. I walked a little off the path, the sound of my boots crunching on the dirt the only noise around me. That's when I saw him. At first I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the firelight, but then I froze, heart hammering in my chest. There, just past the edge of the campfire's light, was a man, or at least I thought it was a man. He was lying on his stomach in the brush, barely visible under the camouflage of what looked like a ghillie suit, the kind of suit hunters wear to blend into their surroundings. But this wasn't some hunter looking for game. This was something else. I couldn't breathe. My eyes locked onto him, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of it. He was staring directly at our campsite. His face was hidden by the camouflage, but I could feel his eyes on me. And the worst part? He saw me too. In that moment, I don't know what happened. I was frozen, staring back at him, unable to move, unable to scream. He didn't make a sound, didn't budge. He just lay there staring. And then with terrifying speed, he shot up and bolted into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. It all happened so fast, but the chill it left behind stayed with me. I didn't move for a few seconds, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. And then, like a floodgate opening, panic hit me all at once. I didn't know if I should wake everyone up, if I should run, if I should just pretend I hadn't seen anything. My body was shaking, and I felt like I was about to lose it. But I knew one thing for sure. I needed to tell the others. Now I stumbled back to the camp, trying to make as little noise as possible. When I got there, I could barely speak. My friends were all sitting around the fire, but they could see something was wrong. I think they could tell by the look on my face. I was pale, my eyes wide, my voice trembling. I saw someone, I finally managed to say. They all stopped, staring at me in confusion. "What do you mean, someone?" Anna asked, her voice slow. "There was a guy in a ghillie suit. He was right outside the camp, just watching us," I said, my voice still shaking. "I swear to God, I saw him." The group was silent. It wasn't like they didn't believe me. They just didn't know what to do with it. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to say or think. After a long pause, someone finally spoke. "Are you sure it wasn't an animal? Maybe you saw something weird in the shadows." "I'm sure," I said. "I know what I saw." We sat there for a long time, the fire crackling, none of us sure what to do next. We all felt that unsettling sensation now, the one that gnawed at your stomach, the one that tells you something isn't right. But what could we do? The guy was gone. Whoever he was, whatever he wanted, we couldn't do anything about it now. The rest of the night was restless. We didn't sleep well. I don't think any of us did. The next morning we packed up quickly, eager to leave. We never went back to that spot. Not after that. I still don't know what to make of it all. Maybe the guy in the ghillie suit had something to do with Anna's gear going missing the year before. Maybe he didn't. But that feeling of being watched, never left me. I'll never understand who he was or why he was there, but I can't shake the thought that something about that place wasn't right. We never spoke much about it after we left. It's like we all wanted to pretend it never happened. But I know deep down that none of us will ever forget what we saw in that forest. Not as long as we live.